Welcome to the Killer Innovation Show, the longest continuously produced podcast in history. Each week, Phil McKinney brings you the insights and strategies to amplify your creativity and innovation skills. Here's your host, Phil McKinney.
Try going through a day without using an analogy. I guarantee you will fail within an hour. Your morning coffee tastes just like yesterday's batch. Traffic is moving like molasses. Your boss sounds like a broken record. Every comparison you make, every single one, is your brain's way of understanding the world. You cannot turn it off. When someone told you ChatGPT is, quote, like having a smart assistant, your brain immediately knew what to expect and what to worry about. When Netflix called itself the HBO of streaming, investors understood the strategy instantly. These comparisons aren't just convenient. They're how billion-dollar companies are built and how your brain actually works. The person who controls the analogy controls your thinking. In a world where you're bombarded with new concepts every single day, like AI tools and cryptocurrency, remote work culture, creator economies, your brain needs a way to make sense of it all. And by the end of this episode, you will possess a powerful toolkit for understanding the unfamiliar by connecting it to what you already know and explaining complex ideas so clearly that people wonder why they never saw it before. Thinking in analogies, or what's called analogical thinking, is how the greatest innovators, communicators, and problem solvers operate. It's the skill that turns confusion into clarity, complexity into something you can actually work with. So, what is analogical thinking? What are we talking about? At its core, it's the practice of understanding something new by comparing it to something you already understand. Your brain is constantly asking, what is this like? When you learned what a virus does to your computer, you understood it by comparing it to how biological viruses infect living organisms. When someone explains blockchain as, quote, a shared spreadsheet that no one can erase, they're using an analogy to make an abstract concept concrete. Researchers have found something remarkable. Your brain doesn't actually store information as bits and pieces of facts. It stores it as patterns and relationships. When you learn something new, your brain is literally asking, what does this remind me of? And building connections to existing knowledge. Sound familiar? Analogies aren't just helpful for communication, they're a fundamental mechanism of human understanding. You cannot think in analogies. The question is whether you're doing it consciously and well, or unconsciously and poorly. The quality of your analogies determines how quickly you learn, how deeply you understand, and how effectively you can explain ideas to others. Now remember this, whoever controls the analogy controls the conversation. Master this skill, and you'll never be at the mercy of someone else's framing again. Now, let's put it on the table here. Thinking in analogies is a double-edged sword. I learned this the hard way. A few years ago, I watched an engineer struggle to explain a revolutionary idea to a room full of executives. He had the data, the logic, the technical proof, but he couldn't get buy-in. Then someone in the room said, so basically this is like Uber, but for industrial equipment. Instantly, heads nodded. Funding approved, project greenlit. One analogy did what an hour of explanation couldn't. 6 months later, that same analogy killed the project. Because Uber for equipment came with assumptions about pricing, about scale, about network effects that did not actually apply. The team kept forcing their solution to fit the analogy instead of recognizing when the comparison broke down. I've watched millions of dollars in 2 years of work disappear because nobody questioned whether the analogy was still serving them. The same mental shortcut that helps you understand new things can also trap you in outdated patterns. Consider QB's spectacular failure. In 2020, Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman launched the streaming service with $1.75 billion in funding, more than Netflix had when it started. Their analogy: it's like TV, but for your phone. They created high-quality 10-minute episodes optimized for mobile viewing. 6 months later, QB shut down. What went wrong? It was the analogy was flawed. They assumed mobile viewing was like TV viewing, just shorter. But people don't watch phones the way they watch TV. They watch phones while doing other things. In stolen moments like interruptions, YouTube and TikTok understood this. They built for distraction and fragmentation. QB built for focused attention that did not exist. They misunderstanding burned through over $1 billion. We see this constantly where complex issues get reduced to simplistic analogies that feel intuitive but lead to flawed conclusions. Someone compares running a country to running a household budget. If families have to balance their budgets, why shouldn't governments? The analogy sounds intuitive, but it ignores that countries can print currency, carry strategic long-term debt, and operate on completely different time horizons than households. The cost of bad analogical thinking is enormous. You waste time applying solutions that work in one context to problems that just don't fit. You miss opportunities because you're trying to squeeze new situations into old patterns, and worst of all, you become easy to manipulate because anyone can control your analogies, control how you think. So how do we harness the power of analogy while avoiding the traps? Well, let me show you. I've got 5 essential strategies that will transform how you use comparison to understand your world. So the first skill is learning to create useful analogies on demand. Most people wait for analogies to pop into their heads randomly, but you can develop a systematic process for generating them whenever you need one. Map the structure of what you're trying to understand, then search for similar structures in domains you know well. Netflix recommendation algorithm did not come from studying other algorithms. It came from asking, how do humans recommend things, and then mapping that social process into a technical system. So what are the steps to generate powerful analogies? First one of 5, there's going to be 5 in the total list. Number 1 of 5, identify the core function or relationship. Strip away all the service details and ask what the thing actually does. A heart pumps fluid through a system. Now you can compare it to anything else that pumps fluid. Engines, wells, plumbing systems. Step 2, look across multiple domains. Don't limit yourself to obvious comparisons. The best analogies often come from unexpected places. The inventor of Velcro understood how birds stuck to fabric by comparing them to hooks and loops, leading to a $1 billion fastening system. The 3 of the 5 in this list map specific correspondences, the linkages between them. Once you find a potential analogy, be explicit about what maps to what. Where do things interconnect? If you're comparing your startup to a marathon, then what corresponds to training? What's the equivalent of hitting the wall while you're running? What represents the finish line? So if you do the analogy, take that analogy and break down all the things that define that experience's capabilities, or in this case, running marathons. 4 of 5, test the analogy's limits. push the comparison and see where it breaks down. This isn't a failure, it's information. Every analogy has boundaries, and knowing them makes the analogy more useful. 5 of 5, consider multiple analogies. Don't settle for the first comparison that works. Electricity is like water flowing through pipes, and like cars on a highway. Each analogy reveals different insights. Now, next is recognize what analogies do break down. They're going to break down. Most people fall in love with an analogy and push it beyond its useful range. A powerful analogy becomes dangerous. Once that moment you forget it's just a comparison, not reality itself. The human brain loves patterns, and once we find one that works, man, we want to apply it to everywhere. We want to smother it. This is how we end up with terrible advice like, oh, just be yourself in job interviews. Why? Because authentic relationships require honesty. Now, taking an analogy from personal relationships and stretching it into your professional context, that it doesn't fit. It doesn't work. So how do you recognize these breakdowns? There's going to be 4 actions in this one. First one, watch for forced mappings. If you find yourself struggling to make pieces fit, the analogy might be wrong. When the comparison starts requiring elaborate explanations or special exceptions, it's probably breaking down. 2 of 4, check for contradictory predictions. A good analogy should help you predict behavior. If your analogy suggests one outcome but really keeps producing another, the comparison is not working. Number 3, look for what's missing. What does the analogy leave out? Understanding the gaps is as important as understanding the matches. Social media isn't the modern town square because town squares had time constraints, physical presence, and social accountability that platforms lack. So social media is not the modern Times Square, and that is a bad analogy and a bad comparison. 4 of 4, test the edge cases. This is critically important. Push your analogy to extremes. If your body is a temple, does that mean you should let tourists in? When an analogy gets absurd at the edges, you have found its limit. A good analogy is a map, not a territory. The moment you forget that, you will be lost. Next up, using analogies to explain complex ideas. Analogies are your secret weapon for making complicated concepts accessible to everyone. The person who can explain quantum physics using everyday comparisons has an absolute superpower in our information saturated world. And I would like to meet that person because this is one area I struggle when trying to explain quantum computing to people who do not have a technical background. Here's the key. Match the analogy to your audience's knowledge and choose comparisons that illuminate rather than obscure. Easy to obscure, hard to keep it simple, hard to make it illuminate. Now, here's the playbook. 4 areas on the explanatory analogy playbook. How to use analogies to explain. Know your audience's knowledge base. Number 1. You can compare machine learning to teaching a child through examples for general audiences. But that same analogy won't work for computer scientists who need technical precision. So you got to adjust. You just can't use one analogy and apply it to everybody. 2, start with the familiar. Always move from what people know to what they don't. Such as, imagine your favorite playlist, but instead of songs, it recommends something. Movies, YouTube videos, TikToks, whatever. Ground abstract concepts in concrete experiences. Again, just imagine something, but instead of X, it recommends Y, is a great example. 3 of 4, be explicit about the comparison. Don't assume people will automatically see and make the connection. Say, think of this like this, blop, and make the mapping clear. Think of this as like your playlist, but it recommends X. And then the last one is use multiple analogies for complex concepts. One analogy rarely captures everything. Combine several different comparisons to give people multiple angles of understanding. Identify false analogies in arguments. People will use analogies to manipulate your thinking, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Workplace debates are full of analogical arguments. Remote work is like letting students do homework unsupervised. Productivity will plummet. But is professional work really like homework? The analogy assumes similarities that do not exist. Recognizing false analogies protects you from being intellectually hijacked. When someone uses a comparison to make their argument, your job is to evaluate whether the comparison is valid. Step one, when someone is communicating to you and they're giving you a comparison, they're using an analogy to make their argument. Step one, your job is to evaluate whether the comparison is valid. Your defense against false analogies, there's 5 of these. One is ask what's being compared. Make the analogy explicit. Often people will use vague gestures towards similarity without stating exactly what maps to what. 2, examine the relevant similarities. Are the things being compared actually alike in ways that matter to the argument? Comparing a business to a family sounds warm, but families don't fire members for poor performance. 3 of 5. Identify critical differences. What difference between the two things? Sometimes these differences destroy the analogy's validity. Saying, hiring is like dating. That ignores that employment is a contractual relationship with completely different expectations and legal frameworks than romantic partnerships. 4 or 5. Consider alternative analogies. If someone says unlimited vacation policies are like giving employees a blank check, counter with, actually, it's more like trusting professionals to manage their own time like we trust them to manage their budgets. Different analogies suggest different conclusions. 5 of 5. Demand literal argument. When someone relies heavily on analogy to make their case, ask them to make the argument without a comparison. If they can't, the analogy might be doing rhetorical work rather than logical work, and it proves that their thinking behind their argument has holes in it. So, next up is, look, analogies are incredibly powerful, but you have to build a library. You have to build your analogy library. And that's key. Deliberately expand your collection of mental models and experiences so you have more source material for analogies. Now, the benefit I got is I've got a 40-year career, lots of analogies, lots of really good stories too. But the person who only knows their own industry can only draw comparisons from that narrow domain. But someone who reads widely, pursues diverse experiences, and studies multiple fields can make unexpected comparisons and connections. Steve Jobs famously took his calligraphy class. Years later, those insights about typeface and design influenced the Mac's revolutionary interface. The analogy between typographic beauty and digital design wouldn't have been available without that cross-domain experience. So, building your source material. One is read across disciplines. Don't just consume content in your own field. Read history, science, philosophy, biography. Each domain gives you new patterns to recognize elsewhere. 2, study other industries. How do restaurants manage inventory? How do sports teams develop talent? These patterns might apply to your completely different context. Number 3, learn the fundamental models. Some analogies reoccur because they capture universal patterns. Evolution, network effects, compound interest, equilibrium. These models apply across countless domains. Learn them. 4 or 5, practice deliberately. Make it a habit to ask, what is this like when you encounter new ideas? The more you practice generating analogies, the faster and better you'll become. So, as I say in every one of these videos, we need to practice. You just can't sit here and listen to my voice. You got to practice. So really the practical and effective way to develop this or any skill is to practice. So we're going to practice explaining concepts across context. So here's how you can sharpen your ability to think analogies. So this is 5 steps, 5 actions in an exercise. First up, choose a concept you know well. Pick something from your area of expertise. Oh, I don't know, technical process, a business strategy, a creative technique, an innovation step, whatever you know deeply. 2, identify 3 different audiences. Consider explaining this concept to a child, to someone in a completely different profession, and to an expert in an unrelated field. 3 of 5, generate 3 analogies. For each audience, create a different analogy that would make the concept clear. Force yourself to draw from domains that audience will understand, not from your domains. 4 or 5, test your analogy. If possible, actually explain your concept to someone using one of these 3 analogies. Go talk to your kids, or in my case, my grandkids, or go explain it to my wife, or go explain it to somebody maybe not in data networking, but maybe in oil and gas. Go explain to them. Then watch their faces. Confusion means the analogy is not working. Clarity means it is. And then step 5, refine and iterate. Share your analogies with others and adjust based on their feedback. The best analogies often emerge through conversation and iteration. Now, this exercise trains you to think flexibly, draw connections across domains, and understand the mechanics of what makes analogies work or fail. The more you practice, the more naturally these comparisons will come to you when you need them. So, what's the rewards for learning how to think in analogies and how to do it properly? Mastering analogical thinking is a journey. It's not a destination. It requires constant practice, intellectual curiosity, and, yes, the humility to recognize when your comparisons break down. But the rewards are transformative. You'll learn faster by connecting new information to what you already know. You'll explain complex ideas with clarity that makes you invaluable in any professional setting. You will spot flawed reasoning in arguments before others even notice something's wrong. You'll generate creative solutions by borrowing patterns from unexpected domains. And most importantly, you will develop mental flexibility to navigate an increasingly complex world. When AI reshapes your industry, you will understand it by comparison to previous technological disruptions. When new social dynamics emerge, you'll make sense of them by recognizing familiar patterns in new contexts. The best thinkers are those who memorize the facts. These aren't those, they're those who see connections others don't. So again, the best thinkers are not those who memorize the most facts. They're those who see connections others miss. Steve Jobs didn't invent the smartphone. He saw that a phone could be more like a computer in your pocket. Jeff Bezos did not invent retail. He saw that a bookstore could be like an infinite warehouse. Every breakthrough starts with someone asking, what if this is like that? That's the power of thinking in analogies. And now you have the tools to make it yours. Now, the Thinking 101 series, of which this is part of, is teaching you how to think clearly in a world designed to confuse you. And here's the journey we've gone through so far. So we did episode 1, We exposed the thinking crises. AI dependency is creating cognitive debt. Independent thinking has become the most valuable skill in the world. Episode 2, we covered you learn to distinguish deductive certainty from inductive probability and stop treating patterns as proven facts. Episode 3, you discovered how to distinguish true causation from mere correlation or coincidence, saving yourself from solving the wrong problems. Today, in this episode, you learn how to harness the power of analogies while avoiding their traps, generating useful comparisons systematically, recognizing when analogies break down, and spotting false analogies that manipulate thinking. Up next in episode 5, probabilistic thinking, basically about living with uncertainty, because you're never going to have perfect insight and perfect data. You'll learn how to think probabilistic rather than with certainties, make decisions with incomplete information, and act wisely when nothing is guaranteed. So you want to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the future episodes. And while you're at it, can I ask a favor? Hit that like and the notification bell. It helps with the algorithm so others see our content. And why not share this video with a colleague who you think would benefit from it? Because right now, while you've been watching this, someone just pitched a $1 billion idea using a flawed analogy. And investors nodding along because it sounded like something that worked before. The only question is, will you be the one who sees through that falsehood? Thanks for being here. We'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.
Podcasting nonstop since 2005, this has been the Killer Innovation Show on the Innovators Network.